The crystal chandeliers of the Diplomat's table cast an elegant glow over Washington D.C., quote, most exclusive dining establishment. Ambassador Alexander Harrington adjusted his perfectly knotted tie as he surveyed the room of political elites, foreign dignitaries, and power brokers. After 27 years in diplomatic service, he could read a room like others read morning headlines, quickly, efficiently, and with practiced detachment. "Shall I order for you, Timothy?" Alexander asked, not looking up from the leather-bound menu. His 14-year-old son didn't respond, his attention captured by the string quartet playing in the corner. Timothy's right hand moved slightly, fingers dancing in the air, conducting an invisible orchestra. The boy's left side remained still, paralyzed from the stroke he'd suffered 2 years ago. Alexander cleared his throat. "Timothy." Sorry, father," Timothy replied, dragging his focus back to the table. "The Bach piece they're playing. It's the one Mother used to—" "Yes, I recognize it," Alexander cut him off, his voice measured and controlled, betraying none of the grief that still ambushed him at unexpected moments. Rebecca had been gone 18 months, but diplomatic training had prepared him to compartmentalize even the deepest wounds. "The salmon or the steak?" Timothy's shoulders slumped slightly. "The salmon, please." As Alexander signaled for service, his phone vibrated, another international crisis demanding attention. As Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations Security Council, his expertise in conflict resolution made him indispensable to the State Department. He'd brokered peace deals in 3 war zones and negotiated treaties that others had deemed impossible. His diplomatic skills had earned him the nickname the Architect among colleagues. Yet here, across from his own son, words failed him completely. "I'm sorry, Timothy, but duty calls." Alexander showed him the screen briefly before rising. "I need to make a call. Order for both of us if the server comes." Alexander stepped toward the terrace, leaving Timothy alone at the table. This dinner was their 3rd attempt at what the family counselor had called reconnection time. The previous 2 attempts had ended similarly, interrupted by national security concerns that couldn't wait. Grace Sullivan approached the table with practiced efficiency, balancing a tray of water glasses despite her exhaustion. At 32, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied her circumstances. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple bun, her uniform pressed despite being third-hand. Her smile genuine despite working a double shift. "Good evening," she said warmly to Timothy. "Are you ready to order, or would you like a few more minutes?" Timothy glanced toward the terrace, where his father was engaged in intense conversation. "My father said to order for both of us. He'll have the filet medium rare with the truffle potatoes. I'll have the salmon with seasonal vegetables." Grace nodded, jotting down the order. As she wrote, a silver cross necklace slipped from beneath her collar, catching the light. "That's pretty," Timothy said, nodding toward the necklace. Grace touched it reflexively, a smile warming her features. "Thank you. It was a gift from my son, Noah. He saved up for 6 months of allowance from helping our church's groundskeeper." "Your son works?" Timothy asked, surprised. "He's 13 and very determined," Grace replied with pride in her voice. "He doesn't let anything stop him." "Not even his condition?" Timothy asked, nodding toward a framed photo Grace kept discreetly in her order pad, visible now as she wrote their order. The picture showed a boy in a wheelchair with a beaming smile. Grace's expression softened. "Especially not his condition. Noah was born with spina bifida, but he says God gave him wheels instead of feet because he knew Noah would need to move twice as fast to accomplish everything he's meant to do in this world." Timothy stared at her, processing this perspective that seemed foreign, yet somehow magnetic. "He doesn't mind being different?" "He has hard days," Grace admitted. "We all do. But Noah says that while his body may be broken, his spirit soars. Those are his words, not mine," she added with a gentle laugh. "He's something of a poet." The string quartet transitioned to a new piece, something livelier with a pronounced rhythm. Timothy's fingers began their unconscious dance again. "You like music," Grace observed. "I used to play piano," Timothy replied, his eyes fixed on his immobile left hand. Before, Grace was about to respond when her manager, Margaret Winters, appeared at her elbow. "Sullivan, Table 12 has been waiting for their check for 7 minutes, she said tersely, and the Secretary of State's wife specifically requested you not be assigned to their section anymore after last week's water incident." "Yes, Mrs. Winters. I'll take care of it right away." Grace maintained her composure, though Timothy noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. "And remember, this isn't a counseling center," Margaret added with a glance toward Timothy. "Save the personal conversations for church." As Margaret walked away, Grace offered Timothy an apologetic smile. "I'll put your order in right away." Timothy watched her go, noticing how she moved with purpose despite the manager's cutting remarks. His father returned to the table, sliding his phone into his suit pocket with practiced smoothness. "Sorry about that. The situation in Eastern Europe requires delicate handling." Alexander straightened his silverware. "Did you order?" "Yes. The server's name is Grace. She has a son with spina bifida." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "I don't recall asking for the staff's personal information." Timothy looked down at his lap. "Sorry." Alexander sighed, realizing his response had been unnecessarily cold. "No, I'm sorry. That was diplomatic of me. Not fatherly." He attempted a smile. "Tell me about school. How are your classes?" Their conversation limped along through appetizers, Alexander asking questions from what seemed like a mental checklist of appropriate father-son topics. Timothy answered dutifully, both of them performing their roles in this stilted dance of forced connection. Across the room, the door to the kitchen swung open, and a young teenage boy in a wheelchair rolled in, his face bright with excitement. Noah Sullivan navigated the narrow spaces between tables with expert precision, his sandy blonde hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd rushed here. Grace emerged from the kitchen, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Noah, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be at youth group with Pastor Warren." "It ended early because of the storm warning," Noah explained. "Pastor Samuel dropped me off. I finished my history project, Mom. I got to present it first, and Miss Jenkins said it was the best in the class." Grace's face melted into pride, though Timothy could see her glancing nervously at Margaret, who was watching the interaction with narrowed eyes. "That's wonderful, honey. But you know you can't be in the dining room during service hours." "I know. I'm sorry," Noah said, his enthusiasm dimming slightly. "But I had to tell you, and—" He stopped, his attention caught by the string quartet. "They're playing Vivaldi. Mom, listen." The musicians had indeed begun Spring from Vivaldi's Four Seasons, the vibrant notes dancing through the restaurant. Noah's face lit up, his hands moving in rhythm with the music. "I love this piece," he said, his wheelchair swaying slightly as he conducted along with the music. Margaret approached, her expression thunderous. "Sullivan, you know the policy about family visits during service hours." "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. He'll wait in the break room until my shift ends." "See that he does. Immediately." Margaret's voice left no room for negotiation. Noah's smile faltered as he registered the tension. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to get you in trouble." "It's not your fault, sweetie," Grace assured him. "Just give me a minute to deliver these orders, and then I'll show you to the break room." Noah nodded, backing his wheelchair away. As he turned, his wheel caught on the plush carpet, causing him to bump into a nearby table. The jolt sent a water glass toppling, splashing onto the suit of a distinguished-looking gentleman. The restaurant fell silent. Noah froze, mortified. "I'm so sorry, sir," he stammered. "It was an accident." The man, whom Timothy recognized as the French ambassador, looked down at his wet suit with dismay. "This is precisely why children don't belong in establishments like this," Margaret declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Sullivan, get him out of here, and the cost of dry cleaning will come from your paycheck." Grace rushed over, napkins in hand. "I'm terribly sorry, Ambassador Beaumont. Please allow me to—" "It's fine," the French ambassador said stiffly, though his expression suggested otherwise. Noah's face had drained of color, his earlier joy completely extinguished. "I'm really sorry," he whispered again. Timothy watched the scene unfold, something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. He glanced at his father, expecting to see the diplomatic mask of polite disinterest Alexander typically wore when witnessing others' discomfort. Instead, Alexander was watching the boy with an unreadable expression. The string quartet, momentarily paused during the commotion, resumed playing Vivaldi. The notes seemed to revive something in Noah. Despite his embarrassment, his fingers began to move with the music again, a small, unconscious expression of the joy that had been so quickly squashed. Without warning, Timothy stood up. "I'd like to dance," he announced, loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. Alexander stared at his son. "Timothy, what are you—" "The music," Timothy said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "It's meant for dancing." He walked to where Noah sat, the boy's eyes wide with surprise. "Would you lead? I can't use my left side very well, but I can follow." Noah looked to his mother in confusion. Grace seemed equally bewildered. "Young man, please return to your seat," Margaret said firmly. "This is a five-star establishment, not a dance hall." Timothy held out his right hand to Noah. "One dance. To Vivaldi." Something sparked in Noah's eyes, recognition of a kindred spirit, perhaps. Slowly he extended his hand. "I don't really know how to dance from a wheelchair." "Then we'll figure it out together," Timothy replied. Alexander stood, his diplomatic instincts sensing a situation spiraling beyond appropriate boundaries. "Timothy, that's enough. You're causing a scene." But Timothy didn't sit down. For the first time since his stroke, since his mother's death, he was choosing to move towards something instead of away. "Just one dance, Father. Please." The restaurant had gone completely silent except for the music. All eyes were on the disabled boy standing next to the boy in the wheelchair, their hands almost touching. "This is completely inappropriate," Margaret insisted, looking to Alexander for support. "Ambassador Harrington, surely you agree this disruption—" "Let them dance." The voice came from the French ambassador, who had risen from his seat, his wetsuit forgotten. The boy apologized sincerely for the accident. "The least we can do is allow them this small moment of joy, non?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed, caught between her rigid adherence to protocol and the wishes of an international diplomat. Noah looked up at Timothy with a shy smile. "I don't know the steps." "Neither do I," Timothy confessed. "Not anymore." Noah took a deep breath, then rolled his wheelchair back slightly, creating space in the aisle between tables. "Then let's make them up." What happened next would be described differently by everyone who witnessed it. Some would call it beautiful, others awkward, some would say it was inappropriate, others divinely inspired, but no one who saw it would ever forget it. Noah began to move his wheelchair in time with Vivaldi's Spring, his motions tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Timothy followed, his right side fluid, his left side stiff, but participating in its own way. They created a dance that accommodated both their bodies. Noah leading from his wheelchair, Timothy following with his partial mobility. It wasn't graceful in any conventional sense, but it was honest, authentic. Two broken bodies moving together in defiance of their limitations. Grace watched, tears filling her eyes. Alexander stood frozen, his diplomatic mask cracking as he witnessed his son, his withdrawn, silent son, come alive before his eyes. The dance lasted less than 2 minutes. When the music transitioned to the next movement, the boys stopped, suddenly self-conscious of the attention they'd drawn. Applause broke out, tentative at first, then growing. The French ambassador led it, joined by several other diners. Even a few of the kitchen staff peering through the service doors clapped their hands. Margaret's face was a storm cloud. "Sullivan, take your son and go. Consider yourself on probation." "Yes, Ma'am," Grace said quietly, moving to Noah's side. "Wait." Alexander stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms filled with world leaders. That won't be necessary. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, handing it to Grace. My son, clearly connected with yours in a way I haven't seen since. He paused, regaining his composure. I'd like to speak with you further. Perhaps your son might be interested in showing Timothy whatever program or therapy has given him such resilience. Grace looked at the card, her eyes widening as she read his full title. Ambassador Harrington, I'm honored, but it's not a program, Noah interjected, looking up at Alexander. It's Jesus. A heavy silence fell over the group. Alexander's expression cooled noticeably. Noah, Grace said gently, the ambassador was being kind. But it's true, Mom, Noah insisted. Timothy asked me how I stay positive, and that's the honest answer. When I feel sad about my legs not working, I remember that Jesus loves me exactly as I am. He has a purpose for me, wheelchair and all. Alexander's jaw tightened. He tucked his card back into his pocket. I see. Well, thank you for the dance. Timothy, we should finish our meal. Timothy looked crestfallen. But Father, now, Timothy. As they returned to their table, Timothy glanced back at Noah, who offered a small wave and an encouraging smile. Something had passed between them, a connection that transcended their brief interaction. Alexander signaled for the check before their entrees had even arrived. We'll dine elsewhere. Why are we leaving? Timothy asked, a note of defiance in his voice that Alexander hadn't heard since before the stroke. I have no interest in subjecting us to evangelical recruitment. Timothy stared at his father. That's not what happened. Noah was just being honest about what helps him. I'm well aware of how faith can be a comfort to some people, Alexander replied, his tone making it clear he didn't count himself among them. But I didn't appreciate the presumption. You asked, Timothy pointed out. Alexander paused, thrown by his son's unexpected challenge. Before he could respond, Grace approached with their check. I apologize for any discomfort, Ambassador Harrington, she said quietly. Noah sometimes speaks without considering how his words might be received. He meant no offense. Alexander nodded stiffly, signing the check with a generous but impersonal tip. No offense taken. Your son seems remarkably adjusted to his condition. Thank you. He inspires me daily. Grace hesitated, then placed a small card next to their bill. Our church runs a support group for families dealing with disabilities. All faiths or no faith are welcome. Just in case you might be interested. Alexander didn't touch the card. Thank you, but we have excellent medical care. Grace smiled gently. Of course, but sometimes the soul needs healing as much as the body. She turned to Timothy. Thank you for dancing with Noah. You made his night. After she walked away, Timothy reached for the card his father had ignored. I'd like to go. To a church group. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Since when are you interested in religion? I'm not, Timothy said. I'm interested in meeting someone who doesn't look at me like I'm broken. The words landed like a physical blow. Alexander stared at his son, realizing how clearly Timothy had seen through his careful diplomacy to the uncomfortable truth beneath. Alexander didn't know how to look at his son without seeing what had been lost. Keep the card if you wish, Alexander said finally. But I have no intention of seeking spiritual solutions to medical problems. Timothy tucked the card into his pocket without another word. The drive home passed in silence, the gulf between them wider than ever, despite the physical proximity. When they arrived at their Kalorama neighborhood home, a stately residence befitting Alexander's position, Timothy went straight to his room. Alexander poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and stood at the window of his study, looking out at the Washington Monument illuminated against the night sky. He'd dedicated his life to building bridges between nations, yet couldn't seem to cross the chasm to his own son. His phone rang, the Secretary of State, calling about the Eastern Europe situation. Alexander answered immediately, grateful for the distraction of global concerns that felt somehow more manageable than the domestic crisis under his own roof. 3 days later, Alexander returned from an emergency diplomatic mission to find a note from Timothy's caregiver. Timothy asked to attend a support group at Cornerstone Community Church. I drove him there at 4 o'clock. We'll pick him up at 6:30. Alexander checked his watch. 6:15. Without giving himself time to reconsider, he grabbed his keys and drove to the address listed on the card Grace had given them. Cornerstone Community Church was nothing like he expected. Rather than an imposing structure with stained glass and spires, it was a converted community center with a simple cross above the entrance. The parking lot held an eclectic mix of vehicles, everything from luxury cars to decades-old sedans, held together with bumper stickers and prayer. Alexander parked his German-engineered sedan and hesitated before getting out. He'd negotiated with dictators and terrorists, yet felt strangely intimidated by this unassuming building and what it represented. A sign directed visitors to Abilities Ministry lower level. Alexander followed it, descending a ramp rather than stairs, his first indication that this place had been thoughtfully designed with accessibility in mind. He paused at the doorway to a large, well-lit room. About 20 people were gathered in a circle, some in wheelchairs, others with various mobility aids, some showing no visible disabilities at all. Parents, children, caregivers, all talking animatedly. And in the center of it all, Noah Sullivan was demonstrating something in his wheelchair, while Timothy watched with rapt attention, a smile on his face that Alexander hadn't seen in years. First time visiting? Alexander turned to find a man in his 50s standing beside him, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "I'm just here to pick up my son," Alexander replied. "Samuel Warren," the man said, offering his hand. "I pastor this motley crew." Alexander Harrington. He shook the pastor's hand, automatically using his diplomat's grip, firm but not domineering. "Ah, Timothy's father. He's a remarkable young man." Alexander nodded, unsure how to respond to praise of his son from a stranger. "Has he been participating?" Pastor Samuel chuckled. "In his way, mostly observing today, but Noah has a way of drawing people out." Those two connected immediately. Alexander watched as Noah said something that made Timothy laugh, a real laugh that transformed his face. "Yes, I noticed that the other night." At the diplomat's table, Pastor Samuel nodded. Grace mentioned the incident. Noah talked about nothing else for days, dancing with his new friend to Vivaldi. A woman approached them, her face lighting up when she saw Alexander. "Ambassador Harrington, I'm so glad you came. I'm Grace Sullivan from the restaurant. We didn't get a proper introduction that night." Alexander shook her hand, noting that she looked different out of her waitress uniform, more confident somehow. "Yes, of course. I must apologize for my abrupt departure that evening." No apology necessary," Grace assured him. "I'm just thrilled Timothy wanted to join us. Noah's been so excited to show him our music program." "Music program?" Alexander echoed. "That's actually what we're setting up for now," Pastor Samuel explained. "The second half of our gathering is always creative expression, music, art, dance, whatever helps people express what they sometimes can't say in words." As if on cue, several group members began setting up instruments at one side of the room, an electronic keyboard, guitars, a drum set with adaptive equipment, and various percussion instruments. "Noah's our percussionist," Grace said proudly. "He has quite the sense of rhythm." "I've noticed," Alexander said, remembering how the boy had moved his wheelchair in perfect time with Vivaldi. "Would you like to stay?" Pastor Samuel asked. "Visitors are always welcome." Alexander was formulating a polite refusal when Timothy spotted him. His son's expression flickered from surprise to something that looked uncomfortably like disappointment at seeing him there. "I should go," Alexander said. "I have work to attend to." "Dad?" Timothy had wheeled over with Noah beside him. "What are you doing here?" "I came to pick you up." Alexander explained. "But I can wait in the car if you're not ready." "You should stay," Noah said brightly. "We're about to jam, and it's going to be awesome. Timothy said he used to play piano." Alexander saw his son tense, waiting for him to mention the obvious, that Timothy could no longer play with his left hand paralyzed. "Is that right?" Alexander said instead. "I wasn't aware they had a piano here." "It's a keyboard," Noah explained, "and we've been working on adaptive techniques for people with limited mobility. I could show you what we figured out for Timothy." Before Alexander could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. A young woman in her 20s was crying, being supported by an older woman who appeared to be her mother. "I'm sorry," the younger woman sobbed. "I shouldn't have come. I can't do this." Pastor Samuel excused himself and went to them, his manner gentle as he spoke with them quietly. After a moment, he led them to chairs slightly removed from the main group. "That's Bethany," Noah explained in a whisper. "She was in a car accident 3 months ago. First time she's come to group." Alexander watched as several members approached the young woman, offering quiet words of encouragement. There was no pity in their expressions, only understanding and genuine welcome. "Everyone remembers their first time here," Grace said softly. "That moment when you realize you're not alone. We should give them space," Noah decided, turning his wheelchair toward the instruments. "Come on, Timothy, let's show your dad what we worked out." Timothy hesitated, looking at Alexander. "You don't have to stay." The diplomatic response would be to excuse himself gracefully. The fatherly response. Alexander wasn't entirely sure what that should be, but he found himself saying, "I'd like to hear you play." Timothy's surprise was evident, but he nodded and followed Noah to the keyboard. Noah positioned his wheelchair next to the instrument. "Okay, so we figured out that if Timothy handles the right-hand melody, I can reach around and play the bass notes. It takes practice, but between the two of us, we've got 4 functioning hands." Alexander watched as the boys situated themselves. Timothy standing at the keyboard, Noah positioned to his left so he could reach the lower octaves. They began to play Amazing Grace, Noah handling the bass notes while Timothy played the melody with his right hand. It was imperfect. They missed notes, their timing occasionally faltered, and the arrangement was simplified. But they were making music together, finding a way to create beauty despite their limitations. Around them, other group members joined in, some singing, others adding gentle percussion or guitar. The music swelled, imperfect yet somehow more moving because of those imperfections. Alexander found himself rooted to the spot, unable to leave as he'd planned. Something in the simple hymn, a song he recognized but had never truly listened to, penetrated the carefully constructed walls of his diplomatic reserve. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The words washed over him as he watched his son play, really play, for the first time since the stroke. Timothy's face was a study in concentration, but there was joy there too, a joy Alexander had feared was lost forever. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." A hand touched his arm lightly. Grace stood beside him, her eyes on the boys at the keyboard. "Music was always Noah's therapy," she said quietly. "When the doctors said he'd never walk, we focused on what he could do, not what he couldn't. His hands work perfectly, so we put instruments in them." Alexander nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "The hardest part wasn't the diagnosis," Grace continued. "It was letting go of the future I'd imagined for him and accepting the one God had actually planned. A different future, but no less valuable, no less beautiful." The music continued around them, the group now singing the second verse. Alexander noticed Bethany, the young woman who had been crying, now wiping her tears as she softly joined in the singing. "When did it get easier?" Alexander asked, the question escaping before he could censor it. Grace considered this thoughtfully. "It didn't, not really. It got different. I stopped fighting against our reality and started working with it." She smiled as Noah successfully managed a complex bass line, his face triumphant. Some days are still incredibly hard, but I'm not alone in carrying it anymore. Because of your faith, Alexander said, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. Partly, Grace acknowledged, but also because of this community, because Noah taught me that joy isn't dependent on circumstances, because I finally understood that accepting help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. The song ended, and applause filled the room. Noah and Timothy exchanged a high five, both beaming with accomplishment. "Your son has a gift," Grace said. "Not despite his disability, but alongside it. Maybe even partly because of it. He feels music differently now." Alexander watched as Timothy stayed at the keyboard, experimenting with notes, his right hand moving with growing confidence. Other group members were setting up for the next song, but Timothy seemed lost in his own musical world. "I don't know how to help him," Alexander admitted, the words painfully honest. "Have you asked him what he needs?" Grace suggested gently. Alexander looked at her, startled by the simplicity of the question. In his diplomatic career, he prided himself on understanding the unspoken needs of nations and leaders, yet he'd never directly asked his own son what he needed most. "I should get Timothy home," he said, retreating behind formality. "He has physical therapy tomorrow." Grace nodded, not pushing further. "You're both welcome any time. No pressure, no expectations." Alexander thanked her and went to collect Timothy, who reluctantly said goodbye to Noah with promises to return next week. On the drive home, Timothy was more animated than Alexander had seen in months, talking about the adaptive music techniques Noah had shown him. "He says I could relearn piano with just my right hand. There are pieces written specifically for one hand, and ways to adapt other music." Timothy's excitement was palpable. "Noah's been playing drums since he was 7. He says it's not about what you can't do, but finding new ways to do what you love." Alexander listened, really listened, hearing not just his son's words, but the hope behind them. "Would you like to start piano lessons again? I'm sure we could find a teacher who specializes in adaptive techniques." Timothy looked at him in surprise. "Really? You wouldn't mind?" "Why would I mind?" Timothy stared out the window. "You haven't wanted to hear me play since Mom died. You got rid of her piano." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He had indeed donated Rebecca's grand piano to a music school shortly after her funeral, unable to bear the silence of the instrument she had once brought to life. He hadn't considered what that might communicate to Timothy. "I thought it would be too painful for both of us," Alexander said carefully. "But if you want to play again, we'll get you a new piano. Today, if you'd like." Timothy was quiet for a moment. "Noah invited me to church on Sunday." Alexander tensed. "Timothy, I respect your interest in this support group, but church is different. Your mother and I agreed to raise you without religious influence so you could make your own decisions when you were older. I'm 14 now. Still young to be making philosophical commitments." Timothy turned to look at his father directly. "You negotiate with people of every faith in your job. You respect their beliefs. That's different. It's diplomatic." "Maybe I don't need you to be diplomatic," Timothy said quietly. "Maybe I just need you to be my dad." They arrived home in silence, the conversation unresolved. Alexander retreated to his study, telling himself he needed to prepare for tomorrow's Security Council meeting. In reality, he was hiding from the uncomfortable truths his son had spoken. On his desk sat a framed photo of Rebecca, brilliant, beautiful Rebecca, who had balanced his diplomatic reserve with her passionate embrace of life. What would she tell him now? She had been the spiritual one, though not religious in any traditional sense. "The universe has a heartbeat," she used to say. "I don't need to name it to feel it." Alexander had indulged what he considered her harmless spiritual musings, while maintaining his own rational agnosticism. Now, faced with Timothy's interest in church, he found himself irrationally protective, as if his son's potential faith somehow threatened the delicate equilibrium of their grieving. The next morning, Alexander found Timothy at the breakfast table earlier than usual. "I've been thinking about what you said," Alexander began, pouring himself coffee. "If you want to attend this church with Noah, I won't object. But I'd like to understand what you're finding there that appeals to you." Timothy looked up from his cereal. "They don't stare at my arm. Or if they do, it's because they're figuring out how to help me use it, not because they're sorry for me." "I see." Alexander sat down, processing this. "And the religious aspect?" Timothy shrugged. "I don't know yet. Noah talks about God like he's his friend. It's different from how they taught about religion in world history class." He hesitated. "They're having a father-son activity night next week. Noah invited both of us." Alexander nearly choked on his coffee. "Both of us?" "It's not churchy," Timothy added quickly. "Just games and food. Noah says a lot of the dads aren't religious either." Alexander studied his son's face, hopeful but braced for rejection. He thought of the brief moment of connection they'd shared, watching Timothy play the keyboard with Noah. "I'll check my schedule," he said finally. Timothy's face lit up. "Really? No promises," Alexander cautioned. "The situation in Eastern Europe is volatile." "Right," Timothy nodded, his excitement dimming. "Work comes first." "That's not—" Alexander began, then stopped himself. Wasn't that exactly the message he'd been sending? "I'll do my best to make it work," he amended. Timothy nodded, clearly not getting his hopes up. Later that day, Alexander sat in a high-level briefing at the State Department, his mind uncharacteristically divided. William Fairchild, his closest colleague in the diplomatic corps, noticed his distraction. "Everything all right, Alex? You seem 1,000 miles away from these border negotiations." Alexander refocused on the satellite images displayed on the screen. "I'm fine. Just some personal matters requiring attention." William raised an eyebrow. "Must be serious to distract the architect. Anything I can help with?" For a moment, Alexander considered confiding in his colleague. William had 2 teenagers of his own, and had somehow maintained both a successful diplomatic career and a close family life. "How do you do it?" Alexander asked abruptly. "Balance all this with family?" William looked surprised by the question. "Not always well," he admitted, "but I learned something early on that helped. There will always be another international crisis, but my kids will only grow up once." "Some crises can't wait," Alexander pointed out. "True," William acknowledged. "But I found that when I prioritized my family whenever possible, I actually became more effective at work, more focused when I was here, because I wasn't carrying the weight of what I was missing at home." Alexander considered this as the briefing continued around them, when his phone vibrated with a text from Timothy's caregiver. "Timothy asking if you'll attend father-son night tomorrow. He made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week ago." "I need to step out," he whispered to William. "Can you cover the Eastern Europe portion?" William's eyebrows shot up, but he nodded. "Of course." Alexander slipped out of the meeting and called his assistant. "Cancel my evening meetings tomorrow. Family commitment." The father-son event at Cornerstone Community Church was nothing like Alexander expected. The church gymnasium was transformed into a series of game stations, basketball with adjustable heights, adaptive video game setups, a cooking challenge, and various table games designed to be played with varying physical abilities. Noah spotted them immediately upon arrival. "Timothy, Ambassador Harrington, you came." He wheeled over rapidly, his father jogging to keep up with him. "Noah, slow down," the man called, reaching them slightly out of breath. "Sorry about that. I'm James Sullivan, Noah's dad." He extended his hand to Alexander. "It's an honor to meet you, Ambassador." Alexander shook his hand, noting the paint stains and calluses. "Please, just Alexander tonight. I'm not here in any official capacity." "Dad's a mural artist," Noah explained proudly. "He paints all over the city. He did the big one at Children's National Hospital." James looked embarrassed by his son's enthusiasm. "Just a job. A meaningful one," Alexander said sincerely. Art in healing spaces makes a significant difference. Timothy was already deep in conversation with Noah about which games to try first. The boys moved off toward an adapted basketball setup, leaving the fathers to follow. "Grace mentioned meeting you," James said. "She was impressed." "By what?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious. "That you came to the support group to watch Timothy play. Many parents don't make it that far." Alexander felt a twinge of guilt, knowing he'd initially gone only to pick Timothy up, not to participate. "Your wife has been very kind to my son." James smiled proudly. "That's Grace. She sees people, really sees them." "How long have you been coming to this church?" Alexander asked, trying to gauge whether he was speaking to a lifelong believer or a more recent convert. "About 5 years," James replied. "After Noah's last major surgery. We were at a really low point. Grace was working 3 jobs. I was taking any commission I could get, and Noah was in constant pain. Someone invited us here and—" He shrugged. It helped. Not instantly, but over time. They reached the basketball area, where Noah was demonstrating to Timothy how to shoot from his level. The basket had been lowered to accommodate players of different heights and abilities. "Did you struggle with the religious aspect?" Alexander asked, keeping his voice low. James chuckled. "Massively. I was raised atheist, thought all this God stuff was a crutch for weak minds, argued with Pastor Samuel for months before I admitted there might be something to it." Alexander watched as Timothy made a basket, his face lighting up with accomplishment. Noah cheered, as if Timothy had just won an Olympic gold medal. And now, James considered the question seriously, "Now, I believe there's more to life than what we can see or prove. That suffering doesn't have to be meaningless. That my son's condition isn't a mistake or a punishment, but part of a bigger story we don't fully understand." They watched their sons play together, each adapting to the other's abilities without commentary or self-consciousness. "Noah never complains," Alexander observed. "How did you manage that?" "We didn't," James admitted. "He complains plenty at home, gets frustrated, asks why he was born this way, grieves what he can't do. We don't sugarcoat it or tell him to be grateful it's not worse. We just remind him he's loved exactly as he is, by us and by God." The evening progressed through various activities, fathers and sons competing together in teams. Alexander found himself genuinely enjoying the playful atmosphere, the focus on what each person could contribute rather than their limitations. Pastor Samuel approached as Alexander was attempting to frost a cupcake blindfolded, while Timothy gave him directions, part of a trust-building game that had them both laughing at the disastrous results. "I see you're discovering the profound theological truth that none of us can see clearly without help," the pastor said with a smile. Alexander removed the blindfold, surveying his lopsided cupcake. "I believe my diplomatic immunity protects me from any food safety violations I may have just committed." Pastor Samuel laughed. "Your son's a remarkable young man. He and Noah have become fast friends." "Yes, I've noticed." Alexander watched as Timothy and Noah compared their equally disastrous cupcakes at a nearby table. "I want to thank you for welcoming him without pressure. That's not how faith works," Pastor Samuel said simply. "You can't pressure someone into a relationship with God any more than you can pressure them into a friendship. It has to be freely chosen." "A diplomatic answer," Alexander observed. "Before I was a pastor, I was a negotiator for Doctors Without Borders," Samuel revealed. "Spent 15 years in conflict zones arranging medical access. I understand the diplomatic mindset." Alexander looked at him with new interest. "What changed?" "I got shot," Samuel said matter-of-factly. "Spent 6 months recovering. Had a lot of time to think about what really matters. Decided I wanted to build peace from the inside out, starting with individual hearts, rather than trying to manage conflicts after they've already exploded." Before Alexander could respond, a commotion broke out across the gym. Noah had accidentally rolled his wheelchair over another boy's foot, and the boy, a teenager larger than Noah, had reacted by pushing Noah's wheelchair. "You did that on purpose?" the boy accused. I didn't, Noah protested. I'm sorry, Jared. It was an accident. Timothy stepped between them. He said he was sorry. Stay out of this, Gimpy, Jared snapped. The slur hung in the air. Alexander moved immediately toward the confrontation, diplomatic instincts kicking in to diffuse the situation. But James Sullivan got there first, placing a calm hand on Jared's shoulder. Hey, buddy, I know that wasn't your best moment, James said quietly. Want to try again? Jared shrugged off the hand, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He's always running into people. He thinks because he's in that chair he can do whatever he wants. That's not true, Noah said, his voice smaller now. Alexander reached the group, standing beside Timothy protectively. A man who was clearly Jared's father approached, looking mortified. Jared, apologize immediately, he ordered. For what? He ran into me. Alexander noticed something in the boy's defiant stance, not just anger, but pain. Before any of the adults could intervene further, Timothy spoke. I get it, he said to Jared. You're mad about more than just getting your foot run over, aren't you? Jared stared at him, thrown by the unexpected empathy. I was angry too after my stroke, Timothy continued. I said awful things to my nurses. Threw things at my physical therapist once. Alexander blinked in surprise. He'd never heard this before. So what? Jared muttered. You want a medal for understanding? No, Timothy said simply. Just wanted you to know you're not the only one who gets angry sometimes, and that's okay. Just maybe don't take it out on Noah next time. He really doesn't run into people on purpose. A heavy silence fell. Then, almost imperceptibly, Jared's shoulders relaxed. Whatever, he mumbled, which seemed to be as close to an apology as he could manage. He turned and walked away, his father following after casting an apologetic glance toward the group. That was kind of you, James said to Timothy. Jared's had a rough time since his accident last year, star quarterback before, struggling with his identity now. I don't think I've ever heard you talk about being angry after your stroke, Alexander said quietly to Timothy as the moment broke up and others returned to their activities. Timothy looked up at his father. Who was I going to tell? You were busy holding everything together after Mom died. You didn't need my anger too. The simple statement struck Alexander with the force of a physical blow. All his careful management of their lives after Rebecca's death, the best doctors, the prestigious school, the maintenance of their social position, and he had completely missed his son's emotional needs. I'm sorry, Alexander said, the words feeling wholly inadequate. I thought I was doing everything right by focusing on your recovery. You were doing everything practical, Timothy said. But sometimes I just needed you to be sad with me, or mad with me, or anything with me. Pastor Samuel, who had been standing nearby, quietly excused himself to give them privacy. Alexander found himself at a loss for words, a rare occurrence for a career diplomat. I didn't know how, he finally admitted. Without your mother, she was always the emotional compass in our family. Timothy nodded. I know, I miss her too. The simple acknowledgement that they shared this grief, that it wasn't just Timothy's loss or Alexander's loss, but their loss, created a moment of genuine connection between them. Perhaps we could learn together, Alexander suggested, how to navigate without her compass. Timothy smiled tentatively. I'd like that. The father-son night concluded with a simple message from Pastor Samuel about building bridges of understanding. Though there were brief references to faith, they were offered as invitation rather than imposition, and Alexander found himself surprisingly comfortable with the approach. As they drove home, Timothy talked excitedly about the evening and his growing friendship with Noah. Alexander listened, asking questions, and genuinely engaging with his son's enthusiasm. Noah invited us to church on Sunday, Timothy mentioned cautiously. Both of us. Alexander considered his diplomatic schedule, the reports waiting on his desk, the calls he needed to return. Then he thought of William's words, there will always be another crisis, but my kids will only grow up once. What time does it start? He asked. Timothy's smile was worth every meeting he would need to reschedule. Sunday morning found Alexander Harrington doing something he hadn't done in decades, sitting in a church pew. Cornerstone Community Church was nothing like the austere European cathedrals he'd visited on diplomatic missions or the ornate temples he'd toured in Asia. It was simple, welcoming, and remarkably diverse. People of various ethnicities, socio-economic backgrounds, and physical abilities gathered together. Noah and his parents saved them seats near the front, in an area with removable chairs to accommodate wheelchairs. Grace greeted them warmly, looking elegant in a simple blue dress. "I'm so glad you both came," she said, her genuine pleasure evident. "No pressure to participate in anything that makes you uncomfortable." The service was less formal than Alexander expected. The music was contemporary yet meaningful, the prayers straightforward rather than laden with archaic language. Pastor Samuel's message focused on seeing beyond appearances to the true worth of every person, a theme that resonated regardless of one's theological stance. Alexander found himself unexpectedly moved when the congregation sang about grace and redemption. Perhaps it was seeing Timothy singing along, his face more peaceful than it had been in months. Perhaps it was the simple sincerity of the people around them, who greeted them with genuine welcome, rather than the calculated networking he was accustomed to in diplomatic circles. After the service, they joined the Sullivans for lunch at a nearby restaurant, a family-owned place where Grace didn't have to work and could simply enjoy the meal. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from international politics to Noah's upcoming science fair project. "Timothy tells me you're going to start piano lessons again," Grace mentioned as they waited for dessert. "Yes," Alexander confirmed. "We've found a teacher who specializes in adaptive techniques for pianists with limited mobility." "That's wonderful," Grace said. "Music has such healing power." "Noah's been practicing a new piece to show Timothy," James added. "He's quite determined to master it before Timothy's next visit to the support group." Alexander noticed how naturally Timothy and Noah interacted, teasing, laughing, sharing interest without self-consciousness about their different disabilities. There was a lesson there, he realized. These boys had found common ground, not despite their limitations, but through them. "Ambassador Harrington," Noah said suddenly, "do you believe in God?" "Noah," Grace admonished gently. "That's a very personal question." "It's all right," Alexander said, though he felt distinctly out of his diplomatic depth. "I respect those who have faith, Noah, but I've always found it difficult to believe in something I cannot see or verify." Noah nodded thoughtfully. "I used to think God was like Santa Claus, someone grown-ups made up to make kids behave, but then I realized something." "What's that?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious. "Just because you can't see something doesn't mean it isn't real. I can't see the wind, but I can feel it. I can't see love, but I know when someone loves me." Noah's expression was earnest. "Sometimes the most real things are the ones you feel rather than see." Alexander was struck by the wisdom in the boy's simple statement. "That's a profound perspective, Noah. He gets that from his mother," James said proudly. Grace shook her head. "I think he came with it pre-installed." The conversation moved on, but Noah's words lingered in Alexander's mind. Throughout his diplomatic career, he had prided himself on dealing with tangible realities, borders, treaties, alliances. Yet the most significant realities in his personal life, his love for Rebecca, his connection with Timothy, were indeed invisible, verified only through experience rather than empirical evidence. In the weeks that followed, Alexander made subtle but meaningful changes to his schedule, prioritizing Timothy's therapy sessions and piano lessons whenever possible. He arranged to attend the support group at Cornerstone regularly, finding unexpected comfort in the community's practical approach to life's challenges. While he maintained his agnostic stance on theological matters, Alexander discovered that participating in church activities alongside Timothy created opportunities for connection that had been missing from their relationship. They had conversations about music, ethics, the meaning of suffering, discussions that would have seemed impossible months earlier. One evening, as they walked through the National Mall after Timothy's piano lesson, Alexander received an urgent call from the Secretary of State. A hostage situation had developed at an embassy overseas, and Alexander's expertise in negotiation was needed immediately. "I have to go," he told Timothy, genuine regret in his voice. "This is a true emergency." Timothy nodded, understanding in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "People's lives are at stake. You should go." "I'll make it up to you," Alexander promised, already signaling for his driver. "I know you will," Timothy said, and the simple trust in his voice meant everything. The crisis kept Alexander at the State Department for 36 hours straight, negotiating through the night to secure the safe release of the hostages. When he finally returned home, exhausted but successful, he found Timothy in the newly installed music room, practicing on the adaptive keyboard they'd purchased. Timothy was playing Amazing Grace, the same hymn he had played with Noah at the support group, but he was playing it differently now, using techniques his teacher had shown him to create a fuller sound with just his right hand. Alexander stood in the doorway, listening. There was something transcendent in the music, not perfect, but authentic. Timothy was finding his own way to make beauty from brokenness. "That sounds beautiful," Alexander said when Timothy finished. Timothy looked up, surprised to see his father home. "Thanks. I'm still learning the techniques, but it's getting easier." Alexander sat beside him on the piano bench. "I'm proud of you, Timothy. Not just for playing again, but for showing me how to move forward after everything we've lost." Timothy leaned against his father's shoulder briefly, a gesture of affection that had become more common between them. "Noah says sometimes God takes away something precious to give us something we need more. And what do you think that might be in our case?" Alexander asked, curious rather than dismissive. Timothy considered this seriously. Maybe the ability to see each other clearly, to stop performing perfect roles and just be who we actually are, a little broken, but still worthy of love. Alexander looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not the diplomatic heir he had once envisioned, but a young man of remarkable wisdom and resilience, a young man who was finding his way not in spite of his challenges, but through them. "When did you get so wise?" Alexander asked. Timothy smiled. "I've always been wise. You just started listening." The truth of this statement hit Alexander with surprising force. He had indeed begun listening, not just to Timothy, but to the Sullivans, to Pastor Samuel, to the quiet voice within himself that had been drowned out by diplomatic protocol and personal grief. A week later, Alexander found himself back at the Diplomat's table, this time with an entirely different purpose. He had arranged a private dinner in one of the restaurant's exclusive rooms, inviting the Sullivans, Pastor Samuel, and several families from the support group. Grace arrived in a simple dress rather than her waitress uniform, Noah beaming beside her in his wheelchair. James followed with a large wrapped package, a painting he had created specifically for this occasion. Margaret Winters, the restaurant manager, looked distinctly uncomfortable as the diverse group filled the elegant dining room. Children in wheelchairs, parents of various backgrounds, a pastor in modest attire rather than the wealthy clientele she preferred. "Ambassador Harrington," she said anxiously, "is everything to your satisfaction. We've prepared exactly as you requested, though the guest list is unexpected." "Everything is perfect," Alexander assured her. "And regarding Grace Sullivan's employment here, I trust there will be no further issues concerning her position or treatment." Margaret's expression tightened. "Of course not, sir. Mrs. Sullivan is a valued employee." "I'm pleased to hear it," Alexander said pleasantly, the diplomatic undertone making it clear this was more than casual interest. When everyone was seated, Alexander stood to address the gathering. For a man who had spoken before the United Nations General Assembly and negotiated with world leaders, he felt uncharacteristically nervous. "Thank you all for coming," he began. 3 months ago, my son Timothy and I walked into this restaurant as strangers to each other, despite living under the same roof. We were going through the motions of family, without the substance." He glanced at Timothy, who nodded encouragingly. That night, we witnessed a simple moment of human connection when Noah invited Timothy to dance. That moment, brief as it was, began a transformation in both our lives. Noah beamed from his wheelchair, clearly delighted to be acknowledged. "Through your community at Cornerstone, we've discovered something I had forgotten in my diplomatic career, that sometimes the most powerful negotiations aren't between nations, but between hearts. That the most meaningful treaties aren't signed with pens, but sealed with compassion." Alexander gestured toward James's wrapped painting. "James has created something special to commemorate this journey. I've commissioned it to hang here at the Diplomat's table as a reminder that true diplomacy begins with seeing the dignity in every person." James unveiled the painting, a beautiful, abstract representation of the dance between Noah and Timothy that first night. The colors swirled together, suggesting movement, connection, and hope amid constraints. Additionally, Alexander continued, the Harrington Family Foundation is establishing a grant program for adaptive arts education, inspired by what Timothy has experienced through your community. The first recipient will be the Healing Hands Community Center at Cornerstone Church to expand their music program for children and adults with disabilities. Grace covered her mouth in surprise as Noah whooped with excitement. Pastor Samuel nodded appreciatively, understanding the significance of this secular support for their ministry. "I remain an agnostic in theological matters," Alexander acknowledged, glancing at Pastor Samuel with respect. "But I've learned that faith manifests in many ways. Faith in each other, faith in the possibility of healing, faith that our limitations need not define us." He raised his glass. "To new beginnings, unexpected friendships, and the courage to lead by following." As the gathering celebrated together, Alexander watched Timothy and Noah at the center of it all. Two boys whose broken bodies had somehow built a bridge between two families, between doubt and faith, between isolation and community. Grace approached him quietly. "Thank you for this. Not just the grant, but for seeing Noah as a person of value." "He taught me to see Timothy that way again," Alexander admitted. "I'd forgotten how to look past the disability to the person." "It's what God does for all of us," Grace said simply. "Sees beyond our brokenness to our true worth." Alexander smiled. "A diplomatic way of putting it." "I thought you'd appreciate that," she replied with a knowing smile. Later that evening, the string quartet that regularly performed at the Diplomat's table began playing Vivaldi's Spring, the same piece that had accompanied Timothy and Noah's impromptu dance months earlier. Noah looked at Timothy expectantly. "One more dance?" Timothy grinned. "Think we can improve on our first attempt?" "Definitely. We've had lots of practice now." The two boys moved to the small space beside the tables. Noah in his wheelchair, Timothy with his partially functioning left side. This time, their movements were more coordinated, the result of weeks in the adaptive dance program they'd both been attending. As they danced, Noah leading sometimes, Timothy leading other times, Alexander watched with a father's pride rather than a diplomat's reserve. The dance wasn't just between two boys with disabilities. It was a testament to the human spirit's capacity for adaptation, connection, and joy. In their movements, Alexander saw what he had been missing in his carefully constructed diplomatic life: authenticity. These boys weren't performing. They were simply being, embracing their limitations while refusing to be defined by them. And in that moment, something shifted in Alexander's carefully ordered worldview. He couldn't name it faith, not yet, but it was an opening, a willingness to consider that perhaps the most meaningful realities in life were, as Noah had suggested, those that couldn't be seen, but could be deeply felt. The dance ended, and Timothy returned to his father's side, slightly breathless but smiling. "Well done," Alexander said, meaning it completely. Noah says we should start a professional dance company, Timothy joked. Wheels and deals, he wants to call it. Alexander laughed, a genuine, undiplomatic laugh that felt liberating. I'd buy tickets to that premiere. As the evening wound down, Alexander found himself standing next to Pastor Samuel, both men watching their community with satisfaction. Still an agnostic? Samuel asked mildly. Still, Alexander confirmed, but perhaps a more open-minded one than before. Samuel nodded. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to ask the questions and live in the tension of not knowing everything. That sounds surprisingly similar to diplomacy, Alexander observed. God was the original diplomat, Samuel suggested with a smile. Building bridges between heaven and earth, between the divine and human. Alexander considered this perspective thoughtfully. I'll take that under advisement. As they prepared to leave, Timothy pulled his father aside. Thank you for tonight. For everything. I'm the one who should be thanking you, Alexander replied. You've taught me more in these past months than I learned in 27 years of diplomatic service. What's that? Timothy asked. Alexander looked around at the gathering. At Noah in his wheelchair, at Grace with her quiet strength, at Pastor Samuel with his gentle wisdom, at all the families who had welcomed them without judgment. That sometimes the strongest position isn't standing firm on your own, he said finally. It's leaning on others when you need to. That vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the most authentic form of strength. Timothy nodded, understanding beyond his years, evident in his eyes. Noah would say that's what Jesus taught, that strength is found in service, not power. A worthy perspective, regardless of its source, Alexander acknowledged. As they walked out of the Diplomat's table together, father and son, diplomat and boy, both changed. By an unexpected encounter that had blossomed into transformation, Alexander reflected on the strange path his life had taken. From negotiating with world powers to learning from a 13-year-old boy in a wheelchair, from diplomatic detachment to genuine connection, it wasn't the path he would have chosen. But as Timothy had discovered at the piano, sometimes the most beautiful music emerges from learning to play with the hands you've been given, not the ones you wish you had. Outside, the Washington Monument stood illuminated against the night sky, a testament to leadership, strength, and vision. But Alexander found his gaze drawn instead to Timothy beside him, to the strength that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. Sometimes the greatest diplomatic achievement wasn't bringing nations together, but bridging the gap between two hearts in the same home. Sometimes the most profound treaty wasn't written on parchment, but inscribed on the human spirit. And sometimes the most important dance wasn't performed on a grand stage, but in the small, sacred spaces where broken people found the courage to move together in a rhythm of grace. As they drove home through the nation's capital, past monuments and memorials to power and leadership, Alexander understood finally what Noah and Timothy had been teaching him all along. True leadership often begins with the humility to follow. And true diplomacy, the kind that changes not just policies, but hearts, begins with the courage to dance with uncertainty, to embrace vulnerability, and to find strength in the very places you once perceived only weakness. It wasn't faith, not yet, but it was an opening, a beginning, a dance step of his own.